The night was cold, the moonlight filtering weakly through the dense canopy of trees. The forest stood still, as if holding its breath, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and pine. A faint rustle of leaves stirred in the distance, but even the nocturnal creatures, who usually filled the air with their sounds, seemed hushed. In the heart of this silent, remote sanctuary lived an owl named Midnight. She perched high on a branch of an ancient oak, her feathers blending with the shadows, her amber eyes scanning the expanse of the forest below. Midnight was not just any owl. She was the forest's silent guardian. For years she had watched over the trees, the underbrush, and all who called it home. Her keen sight could detect the slightest movement. Her ears were attuned to every distant murmur. The creatures of the woods trusted her to keep them safe, and she never faltered in her vigilance. The moonlight glinted off her feathers, but Midnight did not look up. Her focus was on the movements below. The breeze carried with it the smell of something unusual, something out of place. She tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes as a distant sound caught her attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but she knew it well enough to recognize its significance. The hum of a chainsaw. The sound was far, but it sent a shiver through the owl's still form. Chainsaws were the harbingers of destruction, the signals of human intrusion into her sacred territory. Midnight's heart beat a little faster, the familiar calm of the forest disrupted by this new, foreign noise. She flapped her wings quietly, moving silently through the air, using the cover of darkness to glide toward the source. The forest seemed to grow quieter as she neared the sound. Her talons flexed, and her eyes never stopped scanning. There was something else, a strange tension in the air, a disturbance in the normal rhythm of the forest. The usual sounds of rustling leaves, the distant call of a deer, or the chirping of crickets were missing. Only the grinding hum of the chainsaw and the occasional snap of branches filled the space. Midnight perched on a high branch at the edge of a clearing where the forest thinned. Below, she could see the faint outline of men moving. They wore heavy boots and carried large equipment, cutting down trees without hesitation. The trees, her trees, were falling, their massive trunks crashing to the ground with a terrifying finality. The creatures of the forest, unaware of the threat until now, began to stir in confusion, their peaceful night shattered. Midnight's wings fluttered restlessly as she surveyed the devastation. This was her domain. She had watched over these woods for so long, making sure the balance was preserved. But the humans had come, encroaching further and further into her realm. She couldn't let this happen, but there was a twist in the air that she couldn't yet understand. As the humans continued their destructive work, Midnight noticed something strange. The creatures of the forest weren't fleeing in the way they usually did. There was a hesitancy in their movements, an eerie stillness to their reactions. Animals that would typically scatter in fear seemed to be watching, frozen in place. Even the wind, which had been restless, seemed to hesitate, as though waiting for something to unfold. Midnight's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. As she watched, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, tall, cloaked in darkness, but moving with the grace of an animal. It was not human. The figure approached the humans, who were so engrossed in their task that they didn't see the approaching danger. The shape was quick, too quick, darting through the underbrush with terrifying speed. Suddenly, a shout rang out in the still air. The workers froze, their chainsaws falling silent. Midnight's wings snapped open instinctively, and she dove low, closer to the action. She could see one of the men, a younger one, now stumbling backward. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear. But the creature that had emerged was not a threat to the workers. It was one of her own. The figure was a wolf, but it wasn't like any wolf Midnight had ever seen. Its fur was silvery white, almost glowing in the moonlight. Its eyes, bright with an unnatural gleam, held a strange intelligence. As it moved, the forest seemed to respond to it, as if the trees themselves bent to its will. The men backed away slowly, unsure of what they were seeing. The chainsaws, once roaring with energy, were now silent, as if the forest itself had intervened. Midnight, perched in the darkness, observed the strange wolf with a sense of growing unease. The creatures of the forest, who had once followed her lead, were now looking to this new, powerful figure. The wolf had come with a purpose that Midnight couldn't yet understand. The tension in the air was palpable, and Midnight's feathers bristled. She had never been challenged in this way before. The forest had always been hers to guard, but now there was an unknown force at play. She could sense a shift in the natural order, a disturbance that threatened not only her but the very heart of the forest itself. As the wolf stood facing the workers, it seemed to make a decision. With one final glance at the humans, it turned and vanished into the shadows of the trees, as silently as it had appeared. The men, still trembling, quickly gathered their tools and retreated, their plans thwarted, but their fear lingering in the air. The forest was silent once more, the sounds of the chainsaw and the men's retreat fading into the distance. But the unease remained. Midnight flew back to her perch, her mind racing. What was the wolf's purpose? Was it a guardian, like her? Or was it something more dangerous? An agent of change, a harbinger of something darker coming for the forest? The creatures of the forest slowly began to stir again, but their movements were cautious, their eyes still searching the shadows. Midnight's gaze swept over the land once more, her senses on high alert. She had always been the forest protector, its silent sentinel. But now, in the depths of the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The balance she had fought to preserve for so long had been disrupted, and she was no longer certain who she was meant to protect. The moonlight glinted off her feathers, and for the first time in years, Midnight felt a deep, unsettling question. Could the forest still be hers to guard? The tension would hang in the air, unanswered, as the night pressed on. The night deepened, the shadows stretching longer across the forest floor, and Midnight remained motionless on her perch, her keen eyes scanning the vast expanse. The sense of unease that had settled over the land was unlike anything she had felt before. The creatures of the forest were restless, their usual harmony disrupted. Even the wind seemed uncertain, as if waiting for the next chapter of the story to unfold. For hours, Midnight stayed vigilant. The forest was not the peaceful sanctuary it once had been. Her mind raced with questions. Who was the wolf? Why had it appeared when it did? What had it meant by its silent departure? And, most unsettling of all, had the wolf's presence heralded the beginning of something even more dangerous? She heard the faint rustle of leaves below, and her attention snapped downward. A movement. A deer, hesitant, grazing near the clearing where the chainsaws had been. The deer's movements were cautious, its every step slow, as if feeling the weight of the disturbance in the air. Midnight's sharp eyes caught the slight tremor in its limbs, the way it kept its head low, sensing the lingering tension. A sudden, sharp noise shattered the stillness. A crack of breaking wood, a limb snapping. Midnight tensed, her wings flexing as she prepared to launch into the air. But this was not another human. The sound came from behind the deer, where the forest had been thick with shadow. A figure emerged from the darkness, a figure that sent a chill through the owl's heart. It was another wolf. This one, however, was different. It was smaller than the first, with dark fur that blended almost seamlessly into the night. Its eyes were not the same gleaming intensity as the first wolf's, but they were still filled with an unsettling sense of purpose. Midnight's heart quickened, her instincts urging her to move, to defend the creatures of the forest. But her wings remained frozen, as though the forest itself was holding her back. The wolf moved toward the deer, its steps measured, deliberate. The deer, sensing the danger, froze. Its wide, frightened eyes flickered to and fro, but it didn't flee. It was as if the creature was hypnotized, rooted to the spot by the presence of the wolf. Midnight could feel it too, the strange pull in the air. The forest was no longer just a place of sanctuary. The forest was no longer just a place of sanctuary. It had become a stage for something far darker and more mysterious. The smaller wolf came closer, its gaze never leaving the deer. Midnight's wings twitched as she debated her next move. She had always protected the forest, its creatures, from harm, but something in the air had changed. The balance had shifted. She could feel the pull of the wolf's presence, just as the deer did, and with it, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the next move in a game it had not yet fully understood. The deer's legs shook, but still it did not move. Then, just as Midnight prepared to dive down and intervene, something unexpected happened. The first wolf, the silvery white one, emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing in the moonlight. It stood between the smaller wolf and the deer, its stance protective, almost regal. The smaller wolf hesitated, its body stiffening. Midnight watched in confusion as the two wolves locked eyes. The air was thick with tension, the forest holding its breath once more. For a long moment the wolves stood still, their silent exchange seeming to pass between them. The deer, still frozen in place, watched them both with wide, uncertain eyes. Midnight, too, remained motionless, caught in the strange stillness of the scene unfolding before her. Finally, the silvery white wolf lowered its head, its stance relaxing slightly. With a slow, deliberate movement, it turned and padded away, disappearing once more into the shadows of the trees. The smaller wolf stood still for a moment, its gaze flickering between the deer and the path the larger wolf had taken. It too turned away, moving silently into the forest's depths. The tension that had hung over the forest slowly began to dissipate, but it left behind an eerie silence, as if the land itself were unsure of what had just transpired. Midnight remained perched high in the oak, her heart still racing, but her mind no longer filled with confusion. There had been something profound in that encounter between the two wolves, something that whispered of power and purpose far beyond her understanding. She could feel the forest shifting, its pulse beating differently now. Midnight had always thought of herself as the guardian, the one who held the forest together, keeping its balance. But the wolves, those strange, purposeful creatures, introduced something new. The creatures of the forest slowly began to return to their routines, their movements tentative at first, but with time the quiet hum of life resumed. Midnight watched over them all, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The wolves had been messengers, agents of change, and though their motives remained unclear, she knew that the forest was no longer what it had been. In the days that followed, Midnight continued her watch. The quiet return of normalcy was only a facade. Beneath the surface, something shifted in the very air, a subtle but undeniable change that hinted at something unknown, something that could not be ignored. The wolf's presence had marked the beginning of a new era for the forest, one in which Midnight would not be the sole protector. The world around her was no longer just a place of sanctuary. It was a battleground for forces far older, far more powerful than the creatures she had always known. And the forest, with its ancient trees and its untamed beauty, had become the center of a greater struggle, one that Midnight, the ever-watchful owl, could not yet comprehend. As the moon rose high once again, casting its silver light over the canopy, Midnight's gaze swept the forest one final time. She had always watched over the land, guarding it with unwavering dedication. But now, she understood something new. Even the watchful eyes of the owl could not see everything. There were shadows in the forest, deeper and more mysterious than any she had known before, and they were not of her making. The days that followed were filled with a strange stillness. Midnight's usual calm vigil over the forest felt out of place now, as if the very essence of the land had been altered. Though she remained the guardian, perched high above the forest floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer the only force at work in this ancient place. The wolves had left an indelible mark on the forest, a reminder that even the oldest realms were subject to change. As she surveyed the land from her high perch in the oak tree, Midnight observed the subtle shift in behavior among the animals. The deer, once so skittish and easily frightened, now moved through the underbrush with an air of cautious confidence. The rabbits, who had always been quick to dart away at the slightest rustle, now paused longer in the open, as though the sense of danger had been dulled. The predators, too, seemed different. Slower, more measured in their movements, as though aware that something had changed, but unsure of what it meant. Midnight could feel it, too. The forest had always been alive with a quiet energy, a pulse that had hummed beneath her wings as she glided from tree to tree, but now that pulse was erratic, as if the forest itself were struggling to find its rhythm again. The trees groaned in the wind, their branches bending unnaturally, and the usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects seemed muted, distant. She had seen it all before, the cycles of seasons, the ebb and flow of life, but this was different. The wolves had stirred something in the very bones of the land, and Midnight was beginning to understand the depth of that disturbance. There was an ancient power at play here, something she had never sensed before. One evening, as twilight descended upon the forest, Midnight felt an undeniable pull. It wasn't the usual rhythm of the night, the slow settling of the world into darkness. It was something deeper. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The animals had gone still again, frozen in place as they sensed something approaching, though they couldn't name it. Without thinking, Midnight spread her wings and flew low, her flight silent as she glided over the trees. The sensation grew stronger as she moved deeper into the forest, toward the heart of the land, the place where she had always felt the deepest connection, the place she had watched over for so long. It was there, amid the ancient oaks and towering pines, that she found it. The clearing was empty, save for the lone figure standing in the center. It was the wolf, the silvery white one. It stood still, its head tilted slightly, as though listening to a sound only it could hear. Midnight watched from the shadows, her wings tense, ready to act if necessary. But there was no need for action. The wolf was not threatening. It was not here to harm. Instead, it was waiting for something. Midnight's sharp eyes scanned the area, but she couldn't detect any immediate danger. Still, the feeling of unease in the air intensified. The wind had stopped completely, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. Then, as if in answer to the wolf's silent call, there was a shift in the forest. A faint rustling came from the trees surrounding the clearing, followed by the sound of heavy paws on the earth. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a larger wolf, its dark fur gleaming in the moonlight. Midnight's heart raced as the two wolves locked eyes, and for the briefest moment, the air seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. It was as though the very forest itself had responded to their presence. The two wolves stood together in the clearing, silent, their bodies close but not touching. They were not adversaries, but neither were they allies in the traditional sense. They were something else entirely. Two forces in the forest that had come together, at the center of something far larger than either of them. Midnight perched on a branch nearby, her feathers ruffled by the strange energy that now filled the air. She had never felt so small, so insignificant in this vast, ancient place. She was no longer the sole protector of the forest, but a mere observer in a greater dance, one that she could not fully comprehend.